Okay, I am with McCall Jones, recording live. He is in his soundproof booth. I am actually on an island in Florida, and we're making this happen. Um, and I was telling him just a few minutes ago, the first time we tried to record this, that kind of the place I wanted to start, and apparently he wrote an article about this recently, is how that uh, sometimes we get accused of pushing an alt-right, alt this or that agenda just for having normal conversations about what's going on in the world. Like that's what I thought we did last time. And so in my normal Facebook post, like I was saying about a month ago, give or take, I posted a survey on the Facebook group just asking like who trusts the mainstream media, and almost no one said yes. It's like 50 something said no. But then somebody's like, I've noticed you're pushing an alt-right agenda lately. I'm like, just because I want to know if people trust the media or not, or and what we might want to do about that, or how that, what that means for the world, since we have like a tough time grasping reality as it is anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So McCall, like, how do we deal with this phenomena that it's hard to even just have a normal conversation without being accused of pushing some alt agenda?
Or even accusing people of pushing a leftist agenda.
Yeah, or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's interesting. I did coincidentally write an article about this just the other day, and I posed it because I was looking at the conflicts or dialogues or debates I was having with people, and none of those debates were about here's policy X. Do you agree with policy X or do you not agree with policy X? The conversation was, here's policy X, and the other person would say, well, no, there's no such policy.
Yeah.
And I noticed that was a very uniform experience I was having. I would point to certain things that either an official did or something that even happened historically that that one could in theory look up and go, yeah, that happened or didn't. But what I got back was a general skepticism of whether things actually occurred or did not occur.
Right.
And in many cases, it's easy to vilify the people that we consider to be on the fringes, the people that want, everything must be Marxist and everything must be religiously based. And on both sides of the coin, we look at them and kind of go, but those are the people, because they scream the loudest, they have the most colorful placards, and they're out in the streets. Those are the people that are presented in the media as basically being representative of these movements and of these quote unquote causes. And there's no nuance and there's no detail as far as what they actually want and need and are trying to go for.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to really think about this. And I'd been in conversation with other friends who kind of think about this stuff as well. And I said, there seems to be an interesting common denominator here. And the common denominator was actually the media itself.
Right.
Because most people get basically 100% of their information from the media, unless they're affected, aka lose their jobs, for example, or happen to be in a city where there's unrest. Most people are really receiving this news and information in kind of an abstract way. In other words, they tune into their little screens,
right,
their laptops, their phones, and in some cases, and even though it's less and less in number, their actual televisions.
Yeah.
And we're hearing the news, and the news by and large now is almost exclusively commentary and opinion. There's very little news that's being reported as this happened, that happened, this is the result, and the police
the
are
facts of reality.
Yeah. So and to that point, I mean, reality itself is questioned. So in other words, people would say, well, how do we know that this actually happened? How do we know what actually happened? And I said, well, there's documentation. There's people who are swearing to this, et cetera.
Right.
And over time, I was getting that response from people that I actually have a tremendous amount of respect for. And I said, I can't just sort of fire back at them, as if they are ignoramuses, as if I don't have respect for their perspective, because I do.
Right.
So I kept looking for that answer. And I realized, wait a minute, let me listen to their point. Their point is, how do I know it actually happened? And the only things that I can actually verify that actually happened are things that I was actually a witness to.
Right.
And some of the things that I was actually a witness to, I can definitely say that when I saw the news reports on those things later, they were reporting on an entirely different event. In other words, the events that I saw, the speakers that I saw, the actions that I saw, the protests that I saw, none of it was, in my view, accurately represented in the media.
Mhm.
So I just began to put two and two together, and I said, okay, how can I disagree with someone?
Mhm.
And that's when I began to get clear on what my question was. It's like, who should I be disagreeing with? Can I disagree with the person who wasn't there, who believes what the media told them?
Right.
Can I disagree with my own experience? Well, that's an easy answer. I can't really disagree with my own experience. But are they invalid when they say that maybe something didn't happen?
Mhm.
So I just kept drilling and drilling in. And I realized that the common denominator was the media. Now, and
Right.
I've always watched, the different sides, if you will,
Mhm.
do their reporting. And I realized that just because I might prefer a given side, on the story, does that mean the other side is wholly invalid? And that was another dynamic that I observed, that people are saying that the other side was entirely invalid, that
Mhm.
everything they're saying is a lie, everything that they're saying is wrong, nothing that they said, actually happened. And I said,
Right.
that's an extreme view.
Mhm.
That's a view that on its face, I'm questioning, because if
Mhm.
somebody is passionate about something, if somebody is, really pursuing a perspective, whether I agree with it or not,
Mhm.
is there any validity to what their perspective happens to be? And with that in mind, I wrote the piece. I said,
Mhm.
I'm really becoming more and more skeptical that we are being presented with any intention on either side of being honest about what's actually going on.
Right.
And I said, what if we are at odds with each other because what we are experiencing was designed for us to be at odds with each other?
Because
What
that's what
if,
sells.
I'm sorry,
Because that's what sells.
because
Yeah,
that's
just
exactly what sells.
yeah,
Exactly.
tension sells and panic sells and outrage sells.
Hmm.
We
Yeah.
we're in the age of outrage porn, which what I don't know if it was Ryan Holiday who first said that, but the thing about outrage too that I've heard a number of times, and we have to remind ourselves the chemical, the brain chemistry of someone in outrage is very close to the same brain chemistry of someone going through their narcotic fixations. So
Yes.
people get literally addicted to it, and that's why people will go from you know one thing to the other and dig and to like your point of how these people are acting, just like denying reality. They are behaving uh and I'm sure they're wonderful respectable people in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
but this way of denying reality and just like closing off all possibilities of certain things that are blatantly true, or they should at least be somewhat open-minded to the possibility. It's actually very similar to the way that drug addicts act,
Hmm.
and it's because of the similar chemistry. But
Well, I mean, we're on exactly the same page on this point,
yeah,
because I was just about to mention the neuroscience
yeah,
behind creativity versus survival.
right,
And, we're surrounded with this phenomenal neocortex that enables us to enter which in effect counts as our creative brain.
right.
But we can only access that when we don't feel threatened, that we are
Mm,
when we are in a safe space, when we feel
right.
are free to explore.
Yeah, we
And
don't
as
feel
such,
like we're prey. We feel like we can
correct.
be the predators, but we're definitely not prey. Then we can relax and unlock that potential. You're right.
Correct. But if we're under threat,
Right.
if we're pressured, if we are, enraged, as you just described, it moves our consciousness into our lower brain, into the
Mm.
core main part
The
of us,
the
our
lizard
brain,
brain.
the lizard brain. And it moves us out of our creative brain. And from a
Mm.
neuroscience perspective, there really isn't a degree of it. It's a binary dynamic. Either we're
Right.
in our neocortex or we're in our survival brain.
Right.
And I think that's a very important thing, because when we are in our survival brain, we are
Mm.
not prone to creative thought. We literally don't have access to it.
Right.
And as such, I began to really see that there's an advantage to the people that deliver information to us, to make sure that we do stay out of our neocortex, that we're not
Right.
going to what they present to us. We're not going to look at it critically. We're not going to
Right.
question it. We're not going to, dwell on it. We're just going to accept it and go, oh my goodness, that's terrifying. How do I defend myself? And
And we won't be predictable, because that's a big important thing for them too. So they can predict our behavior patterns, but if we're creative, we're very unpredictable. So it's hard to make, money out of us and control us.
Correct. All of the above. So,
Yeah.
so then that literally is the definition of the huddled masses. Why are they huddled? They're huddled because they're afraid. They're huddled because they're strength in numbers, and strength in numbers is a product of I'm afraid to survive on my own.
Right.
So you're exactly correct. So knowing that they can control us as a mass, as a group, it's certainly easier and certainly much more profitable to make sure that we stay in our fear mode, in our fear centers, and just are constantly just react. And to your ultimate point, it becomes an addiction.
Right.
It is indeed is just like a drug. So that's what I began to look at, and people actually really resonated with that. People that I've been disagreeing with now for 4 years on one point or another. But when I began to really shape it as what if our disagreement isn't rooted in our perspectives at all, because we assume that that other person's perspective is incorrect, let's say. But what if the dynamic
looking at a different reality?
Correct. And what if, and that's exactly what I began to see, what if their perspective is being informed by an entirely different reality than what informs my quote unquote reality, right?
Yeah.
Because none of this is being experienced firsthand, which I think is a significant point. That if I'm not out there experiencing the rain and somebody tells me it's raining, how do I know it's actually raining? And what do I know? And how do I know what being caught in the rain is actually like?
Right.
But I think an important litmus for all of this is the revelations from the Time magazine article last week that fully laid out the dynamics of how this election was controlled, if not outright, manipulated in that regard, or shall I say, in the absence of any detectable actual fraud. But the entire machine was actually entirely controlled. And it was an astonishing revelation for many, because the perspective with which the people told the story, who the people involved, they saw that they were, protecting democracy by changing how the vote structure works. They thought that they were preserving democracy and protecting the country and the future of the democratic process by literally just changing it. So for me, just on its surface, I'm like, wait a minute. How are we protecting something by literally changing it, midstream? So there was that disconnect for me, and I think a lot of other people. But this gets back to this issue of where does what we believe come from?
Right.
Because these people really do view themselves as heroes. And I can't even identify the threat that they were defending the country against. And maybe that's my biased view of things. But as far as what the previous president did on record, he was a remarkably mild, remarkably mild in terms of his actually enacted policies. They benefited the economy. Many people got jobs. He provided permanent funding to the historically Black colleges and universities. The Department of Homeland Security was actually quite pleased with the results of the wall that was repeatedly, we were told that, walls don't work. I mean, that just sort of defies, logic of sorts. But it's easy to vilify those breaches in logic. My question was, how could so many people believe these things on either side? What's been going on. So I really began to look at the media as if not an outright culprit, certainly an ally to making sure that people were consistently basically upset.
Right. And a phenomena I think I observed, and I'm wondering what you think of this, but I'm trying to understand that perspective. And this is just kind of where I think sometimes I kind of try to boil it down to just some basic pattern. But I think a lot of the pattern that I saw, especially the last year or so with COVID going on, was, you have normal conversation, you engage in normal, just everyday thought with people. And in general, people are never completely satisfied with their lives, but especially this past year with the way COVID kind of disrupted things, and they can't do everything that they want like before. And so in general, if you're engaging with thought and conversation with people, it's even just how are you? Maybe they want to say it's kind of shitty because of COVID, or just things aren't going as well as I want in life. But instead of doing that, it's so much easier to be and you know what? It's all the president's fault, you know. And
That's right.
it's so much easier to like get sucked into that madness and that herd and that outrage of like, oh, if only it wasn't the president, and if only, you know, in reality, just like every other president is, yeah, you can figure out like this and that policy might have affected the economy this much or this much or this much or whatever, which is true, and we need to pay attention to those things. But on an individual level, the president didn't make a huge effect in people's individual lives, but it's the where it did make a big effect is if they could project that he's the devil and everything's his fault. And so that's where people get kind of sucked into that madness. And now, like, the madness that we saw the past month is the whole of the Washington bureaucracy got sucked up in this impeachment thing, where it's like, you know, we still have a pandemic going on to whatever level that it's killing people, and to whatever level that we've got to recover the economy, however we're going to do it. It's going to happen one way or another on the state level and the federal level and everything else. And it's just like it all got sucked up into this impeachment thing, which is overly, and of course there's like doctored evidence of, you know, Twitter and everything else. They couldn't prove anything. And so now, and of course, kind of the big thing that I've been observing lately is it's like, wasn't this supposed to be the administration that's like for all Americans? But it's just even already seemed as much or more divisive than normal. And to the point of what we're on in your article, I think it's largely the media, and the media won't take any responsibility of it. The media wants everybody to be divided, and they want to absorb and direct people's projections. So yeah, it's just like a psychological machine that people get sucked into, and it's unfortunate because most people are completely unaware of it, you know.
That's exactly right. I mean, you know, when you have a policy that on day one
Yeah.
immediately eliminates thousands of jobs, when you have a policy on day two, day three that wants to alienate basically what, half of the country? I mean, is it potentially half of the country that owns firearms?
Yeah.
That you enact a policy that directly threatens and is designed to you know, restrict their access to ammunition and those weapons themselves.
Right.
You know, when you enact policies that will tend to cordon off or restrict or even to that degree purge your political enemies from the political process itself. You know, in my mind, those policies are infinitely more actually divisive than the previous administration. And but what I'm noticing is that the difference is how the press is handling it.
Right.
Oh, I've created Space Force. Well, guess what? There's
Yeah.
20 years of research and
Yeah.
advocacy on why the new branch, which has now become Space Force, was not only necessary but long overdue.
Right.
And when I heard about it, I said it makes total sense. I mean, again, my background is in large parts national security and intelligence, and you know, the infrastructure for the spy satellites, for example, or any other signals intelligence gathering methods, is massive.
Right.
And I've watched it grow over the past 30 to 40 years. And it's to the point now that the Air Force running all of those things, it actually, in a sense, undermines the role of the actual Air Force because it's getting into the specialization of space.
Right.
And as such, you know, there's a risk, there's a compromise going on there in the sense that, you know, how secure can we be if, you know, one branch, you know, of the military is actually unduly overtaxed? So
Right.
to me, it makes, you know, the Space Force actually made sense. But what did the press do? The press basically vilified it. The press said it was silly. The press said everything that came out of his mouth was silly and wrong.
Right.
Now, mind you, on January 21st, Space Force is now the magical hero of the century.
Yeah.
Um, Ultraviolet light is now the hero of killing off viruses and bacteria.
Yeah.
The what was the drug? Hydroxychloroquine
Yeah.
is now a miracle drug. You know, as of the 21st of January. So,
Well, the
so
biggest one on that front is, I think it was either the 20th or 21st of last month when the CDC and the WHO finally agreed that to classify someone as a COVID case or COVID death, they have to have a positive test result for COVID.
Okay.
Before, it was just that they could say, like any doctor could say, that person has COVID or died from COVID, even if they just like kind of like, dry mouth
Hmm.
cough.
Hmm.
So now, of course, the day after the inauguration, the cases will start going down and the deaths per COVID will start going down, and
Hmm.
which of course is important because we have to, ultimately get the economy open because you can't keep things closed forever. And yeah, it's just a strange reality, and I think a lot of what we're getting at is just that we are psychological social animals more than anything, and it's very unconsciously anxiety provoking when we can't figure out what our reality is. Just like
Hmm.
when an animal goes into their new environment, they can only relax after they've like smelled every little centimeter that they
Correct.
can smell. It's the same thing
Correct.
with us, but our environment is less physical and more social psychological.
Hmm.
But we have no idea what's going on in our social psychological environment anymore because it's constantly given all this spin and twist and everything else, and
Hmm.
this matters and this doesn't, and this is real and this isn't. So it's a tough world for people right now, and they don't know what
Well,
to do about it. Yeah.
I think you make a very valid and important point,
Yeah.
in that if we're deprived as creatures, now mind you, our physical, surroundings are pretty much established. I mean, we live in houses,
Yeah.
we go to office buildings to the degree we
Right.
can. So if those were taken away from us,
Yeah.
which in effect the Green New Deal actually, threatens to do in many
Right.
ways, then I think we would go back to worrying about our physical safety in that regard. But I think you're
Right.
right. I think that because the psychological and social dynamics have been literally ripped away from us, we are
Yeah.
disoriented. And that's just
Right.
another facet of us living in our survival brain, because we're like, well, what's next? What are my expectations? How do I deal with this isolation? Now, I
Right.
know that myself as an introvert,
Mhm.
I'm not so troubled at all by the
Yeah.
lack of the social interaction,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I do experience isolation in the sense that I can't travel as freely as I used to. I know
Right.
that I can't really get on an airplane and travel to some other part of the country. Like, for example, I know right now, if I go to Boston to visit my
Mhm.
family, I know that my mother's not going to let me in the house because my grandmother's now 99 years old.
Right.
So the risk of, I mean, I've been tested multiple times. I've all come back negative for my COVID test. But what happens when I get on that plane, fly, 3,000 miles, get off that plane? What did I encounter? Am I now, putting them at risk? And I completely
Right.
understand her perspective. But at the end of the day, there is still a dynamic of social and emotional isolation that I have
Right.
to endure and that they have to endure, to be able to live under this. And if you multiply that to not only an entire society, but multiple societies across multiple countries,
Right.
it's a very, very big deal. I mean,
Yeah.
Ireland announced a day or so ago that if you come back from travel,
Mhm.
you can very well be summoned to court and ultimately pay a fine of up to somewhere between 5 and 10,000 euros
Wow.
for basically traveling, unprotected, or whatever their definition of unprotected is. So,
Yeah.
so this is actually serious, and it looks like it's definitely going to be something that's going to be, with us for a long time. So I think at the base level, you were describing that, yeah,
Mhm.
as of today, I read, well, yesterday actually read it,
Mhm.
was that COVID cases are down by 50%. Now that's
Mhm.
interesting that in the space of 3 weeks,
Yeah.
when it was exploding and we were getting ready for second lockdowns and a second wave, and
Right.
plus the advent of a new strain of COVID, now the
Yeah.
cases are down by 50%. And has 50% of the country been given the vaccination? I don't know. I mean, I legitimately don't know that.
Yeah.
But suddenly, 3 weeks later, it's down by 50%. Oh, and suddenly, just after the 21st or just after the 20th, the CDC announced that they had over-reported,
Yeah.
the actual number of cases, and also we discovered that New York State had dramatically over-reported the number of deaths,
Yeah.
as caused by COVID, to the point now that Cuomo's, even the Democrats are now wanting a formal investigation as to why the discrepancy in the reporting,
Mhm.
occurred at all. So there's a number of things that are going on. And then there's the bigger dynamic of why the WHO and why the CDC, would have, published incorrect information,
Right.
which seems very deliberate. So I think there's a number of issues to
Mhm.
be addressed from, different levels of the conversation. But,
Mhm.
what I wanted to basically make sure that people are really aware of is that we are battling each other because this system is designed for us to battle each other. It's designed to alienate us from each other.
Right.
And and that's the part that concerns me, because the giant or larger conspiracies can only work if at the base, which is us, we are at odds with each other, because
Hmm.
then it enables them to keep us distracted while they do what they actually want to do.
Hmm.
You take a look at the press, and the obvious decisiveness that the current administration, not decisiveness, divisiveness is the word I'm trying to
Divisiveness,
say,
yeah.
that the current administration is actually engaged in. And what happens when the press, which has returned in a lot of ways to rational thought, when they
Hmm.
ask a serious question, what happens? Well, let me circle back around with you on that. Well, we're not going to answer any questions on that. So they're
Hmm.
just literally just stiff arming. If people remember the good old days of stiff football,
Yeah.
um, they're just stiff arming the press that is asking what I believe to be the right questions. They have no
Hmm.
desire to answer what I believe to be the right questions. What's going on? What's going to happen? Well, we're not going to talk about that. And I think I ended our meeting last time
Yeah.
with the idea that people need to do research on their own. They
Right.
need
Right.
to identify the truth on their own, so
Right.
that they can then begin to regain some semblance of reality. And I think I
Hmm.
also said that doing so is actually very difficult,
Right.
but it's also very worth it, because literally I don't believe that there's anything less than our lives at stake. I don't think that
Hmm.
there's anything less than our well-being that's at stake, and I certainly don't think that there's anything less than our families and our neighborhoods and our society at stake if we fail to
Right.
do this. And
Well,
it will repeat.
especially in this time that we've seen the past year ish, where the divisiveness leads to actual violence and death
Correct.
and destruction of property. So normally, maybe a couple of years ago, we could, get things a little bit divided, whether it was for a media cycle or whatever the case.
Hmm.
And yeah, it puts people in a frenzy, but then people go back to their jobs and their lives and their normal stresses and whatever else.
Hmm.
But now, because the world's kind of upside down with pandemics and the way the economy's been, whatever else,
Hmm.
um, it's a lot of taking to the streets and burning buildings and all
Hmm.
kinds of violence and even death. Not thankfully in a huge scale, but at least to the scale where, because of the divisiveness, it can not just be like a phenomena of divisiveness, but destroy life and property, and destroy
Absolutely.
real things that and lives and families and everything else.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to take this very seriously, um and have a better grip on reality, and hopefully get people into their right minds instead of those outrage minds.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that, the information, or information slash disinformation, as people like to call it now,
Right.
ultimately leads to what I believe is the goal of it produces distrust.
Right.
And
Right.
once you have distrust as that crucial ingredient, that
Hmm.
you literally can't trust the person, approaching you on the street, or your neighbor in the hallway, that is what leads to the insults. That is what leads to the
Right.
pushing and shoving. That is what leads to the bike locks being cracked over people's heads. That's what
Yeah.
leads to, streets, being burned. I mean, I'll give you one example of
Hmm.
why I believe that, there's a what I can't call anything shy of being a fraud.
Hmm.
Um, and it was funny because I was reminded of this and having this conversation, I think yesterday,
Hmm.
that Measure R for LA County, which was actually a measure that I actually personally was out canvassing for,
Hmm.
was a measure that was put on the ballot to reallocate funds that were originally allocated for building more jails here in Los Angeles County.
Yeah.
And it was a massive amount of money. And the purpose of Measure R was to say, look, the majority of people that are actually going into these facilities are either mentally ill, or they are substance abusers, addicted to drugs and alcohol. And
Right.
they said, let's apply some rational thought to that, and really treat the people in the way that they actually need to be treated. These people are not seeking to be, criminals per se.
Yeah.
They have conditions that actually need help, and we want to provide that help. So I was out canvassing, and people were,
Hmm.
by and large, I mean, overwhelmingly supportive of Measure R.
Mm,
And when the March election came and went, Measure R actually passed.
mm,
So those funds that were allocated for building more jails and other
mm,
policing and incarceration measures
right.
were officially approved by the public through a democratic process
Mm.
to have those funds reallocated to
Mental
therapies,
health. Yeah.
mental health, and drug rehabilitation programs, which I thought was
Right.
absolutely phenomenal. Okay,
Yeah.
but here's what happened. So not too long after that, almost
Mm,
immediately,
mm.
we suddenly have the Floyd situation. And then
Um,
suddenly we have this national explosion about the necessity of reallocating funds and changing policing. But where the fraud comes in is that when we return that conversation to Los Angeles and Los Angeles
mm,
County, Los Angeles had already taken the necessary and appropriate, I'll call it, steps of making it a democratic process, of actually putting it on the ballot, having the citizens actually vote for how they want to see those funds spent. And we had approved spending those funds in that way. But
right.
lo and behold, the protests happen. Lo and behold, there's pressure for this instant response on the part of the LA Police Department, LAPD, to basically reduce their budget to their police, to instantly strip large proportions of the services that basically the police and law enforcement establishment provides, while completely ignoring what had been this democratically instituted policy of change. It had
Right.
already taken place. It had already done what the people wanted it to do.
Right. Right.
So from my perspective, there's a problem there. So
Mm-hmm.
not only did people protest what they saw as the current state of policing, but they completely missed the quote unquote reality that we had already democratically decided what we wanted to do next, but they wanted to do it by force. They wanted to do it by violence. And in my view, that is a tell. It is a sign that the people that are behind those movements actually don't want anything good for good in terms of the continuity of our current system. They want to see change made through protest. They want to see change made through violence and fire, not through democratic means. And that is what deeply concerns me. And I would hope that that comment is not seen as a partisan comment. I hope it's seen for the reality that it is. If we prefer democracy, which apparently we did, if we prefer rule of law, if we prefer making changes through nonviolent means, I'm sorry, I don't see that as a partisan position that I hold.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I don't know if I told you last time, but it's something I brought up a few times. Is, when I heard Mayor Garcetti saying last year, we're going to reallocate these funds, and not just like specifically like, oh, the public said this, and we can kind of see their point or whatever, so we're going to do that. But the rhetoric is so obviously just political rhetoric, because he's like, we're going to reallocate the funds from police whatever to
Mm-hmm.
over here and help women and people of color. And that's so easy to see political rhetoric just by driving through Los Angeles, because I have driven through Los Angeles a number of times, and if you go about 2 or 3 miles south of Los Angeles, the roads haven't been paved in probably 30 years. So it's like, if they wanted to take care of those minorities or people of color, or poorer neighborhoods, they would at least get the streets paved once every 10 or 20 years, but they're not
Decade.
even doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, downtown, as you know, it's like streets are pristine and everything's perfect all the way up until Olive, because that's where it starts getting to be Skid Row. I mean, it's been famously that
Yep.
way for years, all the way up until it's like financial district, everything's perfect until Olive. And it's like, and the reason that it's that way is because they keep getting in trouble. The city councilmen, there's only like 15 of them, but or no, maybe that's less in LA, like 6. But anyway, there's just a handful of them, and they keep getting in trouble constantly for taking bribes and getting busted by the FBI. So it's not like, oh wow, we know they're gonna do that. We just it's obviously political rhetoric when it's like we're not like, how can people be this stupid? It's like, Obviously, it's just
Well,
political rhetoric, or they would at least take care of the streets, and it can't be that hard. Although I know there's like unions and other special interests involved when it comes to streets, and
yeah,
it's
but
frustrating.
I think it's part and parcel to the nature of how people are informed. I
Right.
mean, I think it gets back to how they get that information, because the information is there, and Los Angeles, is actually a very interesting entity,
Yeah.
as a city. I mean, on one hand, they understand that entrepreneurship is absolutely crucial, and the
Right.
city goes out of its way to promote any number of events and
Hmm.
activities that help small to mid-size, even minority businesses
Right.
participate more in the city's development and construction and contracts.
Right. Right.
But on the other hand, the city is almost equally, if not more so, involved in exactly what you described.
Right.
Let's have conversations of equity and gender and those things. And I don't necessarily see that they're inherently, problematic.
Right.
But when they approach exactly what you discussed, that they're done only for political gain, only for
Right.
political points, that's when I believe that we end up having a problem. Because
Right.
Milwaukee, a few days ago, for example, after saying that, yeah, we're going to literally disband our police department,
Right.
the city council unanimously voted to not only not disband, but to actually dramatically increase the funding that's going to the police department.
Right.
So what you understand, if you compress the timeline, is that
Hmm.
people were lied to up front. Yes, we're going to disband this. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And in fact, all the cities, with a few exceptions, that promised to disband or at least defund their police departments, none
Hmm.
of them, I think maybe one did, but basically by and large, most of them did exactly the opposite. They
Right.
reinstated the police. I think Portland's probably the exception,
Yeah.
as it relates to defunding the police and reallocating those resources.
Yeah.
But every other city that I'm aware of basically reversed their earlier rhetoric, and when it came time to actually take the action, basically gave the police departments even more money, which statistically speaking is the right move, because we
Yeah.
know that the reason that there's difficulty in many cases with police departments is that these neighborhoods are under policed,
Right.
and that where there's heavier police presence, they tend to be safer neighborhoods, and the
Right.
residents prefer that there be more police from a statistical and real world, perspective. So, you know,
Well, and you could just like look at it in a, and I mean, I don't. Well, first of all, the reason this is important is because it's how that we gain our grasp on reality, because it's easy to just be like, I like this and I don't like that, and of course we want to see uh some form of equality and non-bias, but at the same time it's like, what is reality? So we can't let our perception of things that we want that sound like a good idea completely uh, distort reality, and that's really what's going on. And so it just seems like that, okay, so when the promises were, we're going to do this because these things happen, like the George Floyd and a
mhm,
handful of other uh, deaths that happened.
right.
But those deaths didn't happen because of a certain amount of money that was given this place or that place. So
Mhm,
there's other things that need to happen to, yes, of course, we need to reduce unjust police killings and all those things. But the amount of money that's allocated to police isn't going to do it. And in a lot of cases, it might even make it worse. So what we're doing is
mhm,
we're getting into this distorted reality where it's like we just want these easy answers, like money fix it or less money fix it, but it's never that simple,
mhm,
especially in these where we can obviously say, if money were allocated differently, would those people have not died? Probably not. I mean, maybe it would have even led to more deaths because resources were so scarce. uh, Police couldn't do their job as well, and so they made mistakes. uh,
mhm.
we there's just no evidence that says uh, money equals less unjust police killings of any group. So
Well, we can apply that same thinking to another category about,
yeah.
where does municipal spending, have an impact, and that's
Right.
in public education.
Right. Right.
There is no correlation between the volume of money that's spent on the schools or even how much teachers are paid to the quality of that education.
Right.
In fact, there could even be argued that there's almost an inverse relationship. There was a scenario, and it's been a bunch of decades, and I forget the city, but basically they installed, a world-class school, world-class, fitness and facilities into this sort of inner city neighborhood. And
Right.
at the end of the day, the teachers got paid perhaps double what they had been, paid previously. But over the course of 3 to 4 years after all those things were installed, there was absolutely zero improvement in the kids' performance, in their academic grades. And in some cases, even on the national average, there
Right.
was actually a decline, in those schools. So that's what I'm getting at. That
Mm,
you're completely correct. That just because you spend more money or take money away
right.
doesn't necessarily mean that that the situation that you're trying to quote unquote improves.
Mm,
There is one area that's for sure that as you pull those funds and you pull those policing programs, we actually have seen in New York City and other cities, San Francisco, for example,
yeah.
that the crime rate in Los Angeles, that the crime and murder rate, has
Right.
gone up, rather substantially because two things. I mean, number one, less policing, but number
Right.
two is lower levels of prosecutions on the part of offenders. I mean, here we
Right.
have a new district attorney, and he is adamantly opposed to basically prosecuting for crimes that include special circumstances. And as such, he's been letting people go. He's been not prosecuting people, and it's caused tremendous amounts of havoc with not only the public but with also his deputy district attorneys.
Yeah.
And that's the current big deal here. There is currently, similar to the governor, there's currently a recall effort that's going to be happening as soon as the 90 days has passed, because they can't start it from 90 days after he assumes his role,
Right.
but it's coming. And
Mm.
people are very, very not only worried but fearful of the nature of what happens in LA.
Yeah. And another thing that people often don't think of, and this is just maybe in the sort of vein of getting a better grip on reality, but another thing
Mhm.
people often don't think of is, so for example, well, I had more, one of my main businesses a couple years ago was managing Airbnb properties, and I
Mhm.
had basically a small burglary. It wasn't huge, but somebody broke in and stole a couple things.
Mhm.
Um, so anyway, I had to go through the police department and everything else to try to, file police reports, see if those could be recovered and all those kind of things. Anyway, so eventually that whole thing got resolved. But the thing that I learned that probably most people don't know is that any of those kind of things, like a little burglary situation or any of those kind of situations that would take not just like a 911 officer to show up, but like an investigation,
Mhm.
you would want there to be like a quick resolution and kind of get justice if at all possible. But it takes anywhere from a few months to a few years to resolve those situations.
Mhm.
And that is a situation though where uh, it does matter how much funding is there. So if there's less funding there, crimes will be less resolved. If there's
Mhm.
more funding there, crimes will be more resolved because they can actually have the investigating officers put in the time and the footwork and whatever else that needs to be done to
Mhm.
then get it up to the district attorney level and prosecute.
Mhm.
So yeah, if anything, we know on some level taking away funding leads to more criminals getting away with crime,
Mhm.
and it doesn't really solve the problems that they're trying to solve.
No, in fact, I guess in theory, I'll just throw a theory out there that the more militaristic your police department is,
Right.
in a way, it kind of signals the weakness of that policing department. Because if you have more police and they're more involved in the community,
Mm,
you wouldn't necessarily need, armored personnel carriers and all of those tip of the spear type devices to police
right.
those communities. You would have people who know these people personally. You
Right.
would have more officers that are regular parts of the community that you wouldn't have to resort to, body armor
Right.
and smoke grenades.
Right. Right. Right.
I mean, they're
Yeah.
cheaper, but
Yeah. And so I guess this has mostly been the trying to figure out what reality is. But another thing that I wanted to get into a little bit, we talked about a few different things, but is just we talked about it a little bit the other day, but it's come up somewhat recently in conversations that I've had, is the issue of uh, what the Constitution is and if it's important to follow it or not. And
Mhm.
the big thing that I've always said is just like a common sense. if we want to pass something that violates the Constitution, you know, either don't do it, or like there may be some situation where we obviously need to amend the Constitution. Of course, there's been those in the past, and if that's the case, then just amend the Constitution. I mean, yeah, sure, it takes a little bit longer than a 2/3 majority, uh, but why do we want to live in a world where we're like, turning a blind eye, where we're like, okay, we're going to do this that is obviously in violation to this, but we're just going to kind of say hocus pocus, it's okay. Like the argument that I heard from a lot of people on some of these things, like, federal mask mandates and things that are trying to be pushed, is like, well, it's an emergency and it's temporary. Well, okay, well, you can, if it's gonna save lives and it's definitely a needed emergency and whatever, amend the Constitution to say, in an emergency temporary situation, this is how you do it, instead of saying like,
Right.
we're gonna ignore the Constitution wherever we want because we have this excuse. Then it again gets into this reality level of, why do we have laws? Why do we have constitutions if they're just going to contradict themselves, and we're gonna like pick and choose when we're gonna follow it or not? So
Well, this is where,
yeah, we talked about that a little bit the other day, and you're more of the expert on that.
well, this is the area that concerns me the most, is that, we've spent decades, or at least a part of the society has spent decades, moving people away from their awareness of and connection to the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
And once people are separated from that, it becomes really easy to violate their constitutional rights if no one knows or has any working memory of what those actually are.
Right.
Or why, or even to the degree, and I think even more importantly, is to understand why those rights exist. And I think, for example, I think this is why, the founding fathers worked so hard at the Federalist Papers, which I think give the underpinning as to the rationale for each segment and section of the Constitution, why it's necessary, what is it that they were, encouraging or preventing as a product of human nature, that they then built into what became the Constitution. And if you look at the changes that have been made to the Constitution, we have to respect that those changes weren't necessarily to the premises of the Constitution itself, except in a few cases. They were largely clarifications or modifications. In other words, we don't have, for example, we don't have, an amendment that says, okay, we're reversing the Second Amendment. There hasn't been anything that's been that straightforward. We're reversing the tenets of the First Amendment.
Or the Fourth Amendment. The one that still blows my mind away is that we still have the Patriot Act, which is an obvious violation of the Fourth Amendment, and it's still basically been left in place to kind of say like, well, because we were kind of like under war and terrorism and stuff, but at this point, that doesn't hold water. But people are just like, well, we've come to just like say, we'll accept, as the famous Franklin line, or trade our security for, or trade our freedom for security, and that's the way it's going to be. Yeah, and then we have neither. So
exactly, and this gets to why I still emphasize that people need to do the research and the homework on their own. They need to find and discover sources that they do trust. They need to understand that there were people, historically, that were just as passionate about truth and justice as they are, and find out what's going on. And that is the thing that I just have to emphasize again, because if we as individuals are devoid of the information as it relates to economics, for example, as it relates to history, as another example, the more we are isolated and cut off from those, I'll call them realities, even factoring in that there's still flawed philosophies, they're closer to truth and reality than we very often anymore give them credit, for being. Nothing is perfect. And if we're expecting economics, and if we're expecting, history to be perfectly recorded, then we're making a very grave mistake. But if it's accurate enough, if economics is observed accurately enough, we have a better chance of survival than not. I mean, Adam Smith and Susan Strange were very clear that economics is more than just looking at a few indicators. You have to look at society, you have to look at movements, you have to look at, what's popular and unpopular with people as indicators of what an economic structure means. To only look at, production output, to only look at transportation, to only look at, the power grid, GDP are painfully incomplete measures of the economy. But the catch is they're also incredibly difficult measures to move away from
Right.
because of human tendency to kind of basically be lazy.
Yeah.
And Susan Strange was actually quite clear as a political economist, or in her practice of being a political economist. She said, we ignore all these other indicators, and in the process of ignoring them, we're inviting absolute catastrophe. And I 100% believe and agree, believe what she says, and I agree with her that if we don't look at what shapes these social movements and the economics that is also informed in this, we are headed for a very serious, and certainly ongoing, and who knows what kind of types of collapse. And that to
Right.
me is very, very horrifying.
Yeah, it's a strange world we're in, and the other thing I was thinking about, and preparing to this is, well, okay, a couple things, but I guess the first one I'll get to before we go to another is just like, I try to understand the other side's position.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's really confused me, and maybe you can shed some light on it, especially as it's related to some of the things that you've written recently,
Mm-hmm.
is I don't see why this whole impeachment thing was so important to people that it took up everyone's focus for basically the whole first month of this new administration.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I don't know if that's just that distorted psychological reality or if it's something else. Uh, I don't know. I look at it as it's just like an addiction, and that it's it's what was selling in the media, and so
Mm-hmm.
and that the new administration should have been trying to unify, but instead they were pandering toward their base. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. What's your opinion on why the impeachment thing was so important, when I can't see how it would change reality in any meaningful way, other than maybe Trump wouldn't be able to run again in 4 years.
Well, I believe it's as simple as that. I
Yeah.
believe that he still poses a significant threat to their agenda.
Right.
And even without even detailing it, I mean, I think that the concern that they have is exclusively around his ability to run again, and they wanted to
Right.
prevent, his not only his voice but the voice of his supporters
Right.
from continuing to have an impact on the society, because that obviously upends a huge proportion of what they're trying to do, because they know that
Right.
their base will basically do what they tell them to do
Hmm.
if they're given a rational, and if they've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy shaping their beliefs. They've spent meaning the elites have spent a tremendous amount of power and energy and
Right.
effort to shape their constituents' behaviors to the point that they barely have to lift a finger to get their
Right.
constituency to comply.
Right. Right.
And that's a problem because half the country won't comply quite so easily.
Right.
And Trump, of course, represents that lack of compliance. So I
Right.
believe
Right.
that there was no other intention behind the impeachment beyond
Mm.
attempting to have him be rendered ineligible to run in 2024.
Yeah. Well, and it's a important thing that you say there, is how what you want to sort of defeat that base, to because they're not complying.
Hmm.
Where it's like, one thing that I often say about trying to understand that, and I don't even think of it necessarily as sides. It's strange, because the way the world is, because it's not just like a divide. Sometimes we think of it as like, oh, the world is sharply divided because it's like almost 50% this and that. But within those divisions of what we call left and right, there's like probably 100 more divisions within that, so you can get each side to fight amongst themselves.
Hmm.
um but so much, like, when I say, like, a lot of what we'll say the left tries to do, or the only thing that they can really do successfully, isn't so much win, so to speak, like win arguments or win establishing what reality is and everything and those type of things. It's
Hmm.
more of just getting people to comply and to assimilate. That's
Hmm.
why it's like a Borg mind, almost, like in
Hmm.
Star Trek terms, of you just get people to be compliant and then assimilate, and that's it. because they're not going to win the arguments. They just get people to assimilate into that sort of hive mind. Uh, and yet, so that it's that's why I look at it as a psychological phenomenon more than anything. So.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I
Yeah.
find that left-leaning political values are about assimilation.
Right.
They are about conformity. They are also about uniformity.
Right.
Um, and I think that's a significant, percentages of the population, that is their biological and psychological default
Right.
for that type of, yes, I believe this is good, and therefore we should pursue this. And that dynamic has always been in conflict with people who believe in individual rights, people who
Right.
believe in free speech, people who believe in the right to defend themselves,
Mhm.
versus the group needs to defend everyone. And that
Right.
has
Right. Right.
been the ongoing, conflict in societies, historically. It just has different names, it has different brands, it has
Because
different
really, at
logos.
its core, it's a personality conflict, and some people are more prone to one or the other. Because one
Correct.
one personality will be prone toward individuality, we'll call it, and some people hate that word individual.
Hmm.
you know,
Exactly.
I've gotten
Exactly.
into arguments with people lately where I wasn't even trying to get into an argument, but it's like they like melt at just the word individual. Where I'm like, what is a government? What is a group? What is a business? It's collections of individuals. Everything is decided by individuals. If individuals decide this or that, that's what happens. It's individuals, and it's like I'm melting, melting. They just can't handle the individual because they just want to think in terms of groups. And the reason is because that relieves them, at least in their mind, of um, anxiety or the stress of life, because the stress of
Hmm.
life in their sort of personality or the way that they want to live is to
Hmm.
just like give their allegiance over to the group, and then that's so much easier. But it only works if everybody else is doing it. And so
Correct.
anybody who's not giving their allegiance over to the herd is a threat to them. And so then they freak out at the people who are trying to think in individual terms.
Well, here's something I'll throw at you, because I completely
Sure.
agree with your assessments of the product
Yeah, yeah,
of rejection of the individual.
yeah.
But I realized this years ago that there are some people that actually don't have a default of considering themselves as individuals.
Mm,
There are some people that do not and cannot see themselves as individuals. They actually literally see themselves as a group. They see themselves as not distinct and not autonomous
yeah.
from others. And I realized that because it was the only thing that I could rationalize as to why someone was so adamantly connected to their belief in, in a collectivist or
Well,
collective,
and the
solutions to
truth
literally
is,
everything.
it's actually it's a duality sort of thing, and that it's true that we are, every person is a group and part of groups, but
Hmm.
also that is filtered through the phenomena of what an individual is. So we're
Hmm.
always going to be both. We're going to be influenced by our culture, and we're going to
Hmm.
influence our culture, and we're going to have the products that are handed down, that were inherited from our genetics and our family and everything else. And so it's
Right.
all going to be group, but
Hmm.
filtered through what the individual does. So it's always going to
Right.
be that dichotomy. And so that's why you've got to always have both sides of the sort of like way to look at the world.
Hmm.
But ideally, they should be, for the most part, united. And it used to be that way, and it's still that way in some countries, but not most of the world. It's still in this like huge divided world where it should be more of, yeah, different personalities, different ways to look at the world, but ultimately united on certain values and goals.
Well, I'll jump on the statement of certain values and goals,
Yeah,
because when the US was founded,
yeah,
it was recognized that the ultimate minority is the individual,
right,
that there are certain dynamics of government that are always problematic based on certain types of governmental construction.
right.
And when they founded the country, they intended to really take a stern look at what forms of government cause the most problems and which ones cause the least.
Right.
And ultimately, they came upon a what can functionally be called more or less a unique, means of governing.
Yeah.
Because
A
ultimately,
republic that we've barely ever figured out how to run.
Right, exactly, and that we would never actually perfect, because once, in their
Mhm.
views, we ultimately perfected it, it would then eat itself.
Yeah.
So we go from these tyrannical dynamics, we go to uh, you know monarchy, and we
Right.
see the problems with monarchy when governments have absolute power over individuals, and what we want to see happen. We move away and give the individual more power. What that
Right.
looks like, and as such, there are people that believe that that doesn't work, and there are people who believe that it does. And for a
Right.
very long time, the United States has run on that individual model,
Mhm.
but in the background has known that it still needs to kind of be empirical and monarchical.
Right.
I mean, there's a dichotomy of existence that exists
Mhm.
in how the United States has run and been running, but I also believe that that dichotomy has enabled the evolutions that have taken place.
Right. Right. Right.
Because if you look at if you take a look at China, how much has China changed socially since its founding, under Mao, for
Yeah.
example? How much has it actually changed versus how much has American society changed even since the 60s, in terms of what we allow, what we disallow, what our values are, for that matter? Our values have changed and evolved quite a bit, and they're continuing to.
Right.
So, would you rather live under a society that really is exhibiting basically zero change,
Right.
or would you rather live under a society that rightly or wrongly, even if you agree where that change is evolving to or from, would you rather live in a society where that change is actually possible, or would you
Right.
rather live in a society where the change is not possible?
Well, like that was the problem in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, is that there were some good things going on and some evil things, like believing the world was flat and punishing anybody who said otherwise, like Galileo,
Hmm.
of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, but basically, that was a stringent, we're never going to change. And basically,
Hmm.
nothing changed in that period for about 1,000 years. And
Yeah.
there's some advantages to that, but there's also, of course, some disadvantages to that. And actually, the way society needs to work, it's more of like a orbital process that it needs to be constantly going through its cycles to update, but at the same
Hmm.
time keep certain things the same. Just like you mentioned, Mao, which is a very interesting dichotomy to compare China to America, because they definitely have advantages here and advantages there and disadvantages in both. But I forget who said the quote. I read the quote with someone else in Pinker's Enlightenment Now, but he was saying that the greatest uh, Mao in, I think, 1973, he did the greatest single act he'd ever done for China, which was he died, because that was the biggest cause of freedom that China had ever seen. Was
Hmm.
when Mao died, they were then what they were able to do is, yeah, they remained in this weird communist thing that kind of evolved into what it is now since then, but they're this strange communist capitalist thing that has tried to copy the successes around the world, including capitalism. And it's strange to look at the way that's forced from above, sort of like a uh, it's all about the group, compared to America, where
Hmm.
it's ground up from the individual.
Hmm.
So different worlds to look at, but it's important to see those dichotomies. Just like comparing North Korea to South Korea, you see those huge
Right.
dichotomies of difference.
Well, I'll even extend that, because Deng Xiaoping
Mhm.
was the premier that recognized that, after, obviously, they were watching what was going on in the Soviet Union with great intent,
Mhm.
but as they began to really see that communism as a machine was ultimately unsustainable. I mean, I'm sure they're crystal clear as to why and how communism slash socialism, as a governing mechanism, is ultimately unsustainable.
Right.
Deng Xiaoping recognized that if we don't change what we're doing, we will go the same direction that at the time the Soviet Union was heading. It took a few more years for the Soviet Union to finally arrive at the point of dissolution.
Mhm.
But he said, "Look, we have to establish a capitalist engine,
Right.
within within China. And
Right.
basically he laid out in I quite, obviously successfully was able to lay out, why and how that was going to work. So the idea was that they did very appropriately and effectively replicate, the capitalist infrastructure of the United States, allowing individuals to
Right.
provide and develop the innovation necessary to constantly just be churning away at business idea after business idea, and some hit and some don't,
Right.
but making sure that they had that, the state funding to get it all started. And the caveat was, you can be a successful and wealthy entrepreneur, but you cannot be involved in politics.
Mhm.
And that's become basically the biggest offense. I mean, you look at Russia in that regard, that you
Right.
can be a successful entrepreneur even as a derivative of an oligarch,
Mhm.
having state resources handed to you and then you take them over. But we can look at the Gordikovsky case in Russia,
Mhm.
that he was a, head of the largest oil company in Russia, and he uh, was completely apolitical in his activities until he
Mhm.
actually gave a small amount of funding to a local official running for office. I forget what I think it was in. I want to say it was in Georgia, but they were in effect local officials running for office, or people, individuals running for local office. And of course, the Russian government found out about it. And he was basically yanked. He ended up in jail for almost the next decade. He was
Right.
yanked out of his leadership role. So he violated that role. And we now see Jack Ma having disappeared for several weeks for
Yeah.
apparently issuing some kind of politically based statement. He just suddenly disappeared. Where's Jack Ma? Why haven't we
Yeah.
heard from Jack Ma? So has Jack Ma been officially disappeared? So there's that dynamic. So people were free to be
Mhm.
entrepreneurs, free to make billions of dollars or euros or yuan, but they were
Yeah.
not free to express themselves politically. And
Mhm.
and that, in that regard, is how China, unlike basically all the other communist countries, has basically prospered,
Right.
and continues to do so.
Yeah, and then it's yeah, it's really strange. And then you look at Hong Kong, what they were going through, and a lot of people, it's a complicated thing, but
Hmm.
they had more freedom in Hong Kong, especially because they were originally part of Britain up until the 90s.
Hmm.
And when they were released, they became part of China, but in this loose way. Um, and then it was a couple years ago when they had the agreement to keep that way for at least several more years, but then they wanted to change a law, which was basically the law that if you murder, if a Hong Kongese murders someone in another country, you can prosecute them for that. Uh,
Hmm.
so they would just want to update that law, and then Hong Kong's like, we don't like you trying to update your laws, so we're just going to assimilate you now, basically another
Hmm.
assimilation phenomena. And that's what started that whole thing. And it seems like they've been able to push off that assimilation, but yeah, it's like anytime that there these large hive minds uh, grow, they just want to assimilate everything, even at any cost.
Right. And that becomes the issue. I think that the individuals, for example, that
Mm,
really support this idea of a collectivist solution,
right.
they tend to not be so focused or even aware of the outcomes of
Mm,
those aims.
right.
So, for example, I look at people that are constantly voting for the same politicians in the inner city, for example, that promise to make things better. They vote, they get those politicians, but then nothing gets better. And then
Right.
nothing gets better, and nothing gets better. And I really get that the people that they're not terribly focused or interested in the results. They're more interested in being promised a better future, but they're not terribly observant of actually not
Yeah.
getting that future.
It's almost
Uh,
like somebody's stuck in like an abusive relationship cycle is what it makes me think of.
I don't think it's anything short of that.
Yeah, yeah.
I quite honestly don't. It's like, well, I'll make it better this time. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
well, smack. I'll make it better this
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Just
Okay,
like somebody
smack.
who's stuck in a like really abusive, uh, just destructive relationship that's constantly lying to each other,
Hmm.
but they get caught in that cycle. It's almost like the the drug addict phenomena. It's not just about the drug, but they also get addicted to the whole like pursuit of the drugs
Hmm.
and the whole up and down of it. Same
Hmm.
thing with people who want to be lied to by their authorities of any kind.
Right. And I'll throw that out as a massive point,
Yeah.
because This administration was running on the premise of return to normalcy.
Yeah.
And I didn't really observe that people were really examining what normalcy actually was as it related to the president of the United States and the
Yeah.
government. Because for me, normalcy was entering into wars. Normalcy was
Right.
certainly higher taxes. Normalcy was corporations gaining more power than they really should otherwise have.
Right.
Normalcy was lobbyists. Normalcy was government officials and former government officials becoming board members on, the boards of defense contractors,
Right.
and so that to
And
me
basically no privacy for anyone.
and basically no privacy for anyone. So for me, a return to normalcy was not an attractive thing, but no one was really questioning that. So immediately, this return to normalcy has produced what? Higher taxes, higher gas prices, job losses, ongoing anticipated job losses. If we look at the Paris Accord, for example, the
Right.
French government, the French state was just sued for
Mm.
not following the Paris Accord. Like they failed
Yeah.
to meet their measures of the Paris Accord.
Right.
Whereas the United States, independently and free of an international accord that they would be spending hundreds of billions of dollars to be a part of,
Right.
has measured that they have by far exceeded, the
Right.
requirements of the Paris Accord with our emissions reductions, and we've been on
Right.
the path since the early 70s
Mm.
of reducing our pollution output and our energy consumption.
Right.
So, why do we need to belong to this large international body? Oh, because people are supportive of collectivist solutions,
Right. Right. Right.
and they're not at all terribly interested in the actual outcomes. They're not interested at all in the actual results. So, for example, we go to Texas right now.
Mm.
Texas fully embraced a relatively green agenda as compared to the rest of the country.
Right.
They have 20% of their energy is generated through renewable resources such as
Right.
solar and wind.
Mm.
But lo and behold, because of the nature of the cold, the wind farms have all frozen,
Mm.
and the solar panels are completely buried in snow, which renders them utterly and completely ineffective.
Right.
So, if the goal is to go to these green energy solutions, what we've missed in terms of the nuance of the conversation is that in spite of these things, that when things are going perfectly well, these devices are remarkably effective, but
Mm.
these devices are also remarkably vulnerable.
Right.
And we have not addressed that vulnerability. Whereas those vulnerabilities have been addressed as it relates to generation of electrical energy via coal and oil and how we get access to those things.
Right. Right.
For example, I heard someone say, oh, well, the pipelines freeze as well. Well, guess what? I've literally never heard of any pipeline anywhere freezing. And in fact, my brother and I were discussing this last night, and he reminded me of a story that I was aware of, that the elk population
Mm.
that lives along the path of at least one of the oil pipelines.
Yeah.
The theory was that the population would decline based on, oil spills and disasters and things like that. But the reality is that population actually exploded. Why? Because of their proximity to the pipeline, which ironically is actually very warm.
Mm.
So through the processing, I was thinking friction, but it's oil. But the reality is that I believe that it actually, once it leaves the refinery, it's actually, warm as a product. And once it's
Right.
in the pipes, which are also a vacuum sealed,
Mm.
that heat is retained, and basically that heat radiates out through the pipes. So therefore, these families of elk were basically hanging out around the pipeline,
Mm.
and the young elk that would have otherwise frozen to death were
Right.
ultimately able to survive, and the survivability of all those animals living near the pipeline actually went up dramatically as a result, and not down.
Mm.
So what I'm getting at is, again, we're not looking at, or some people are, the people advocating for these green solutions are not looking at the net results of those green solutions. What
Mm.
happens when it snows? What happens when it gets really cold? And that, to me, constitutes a national security threat as it relates to our infrastructure, because there's millions of people right now in Texas who, I saw a photograph today of a
Mm.
hallway in an apartment building with icicles coming off of the ceiling fan,
Wow.
that there was literally ice forming in the hallway of this apartment building. Multiply
Mm.
that times a million. That is an oversight that I think needs to be, in a sense, almost a punishable offense. It's, in all fairness, it's on par with
Right.
the water situation where they diverted
Fort
the river
Flint.
Flint, Michigan. It's
Yeah.
on par of that,
Right. Right.
because they made a decision that directly harmed the citizens.
Right.
And in the same way here, these municipalities made decisions that are currently directly harming the citizenry. So are we to normalize living this way? Well, that's what the Green New Deal would have us do.
Right.
And obviously I'm not a fan of that. So there you go.
Um. All right. I want to somewhat start to wrap it up, but no rush. But I want to put it on a challenging thing, which is uh, go on to another divisive topic, but see if we can somewhat figure out how to do it in a non-divisive way, which is another thing that another phenomena I've been fascinated about recently, especially in, when we talked a month ago, it was on MLK Day, and now we're in Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
And, recently I've seen that the numbers are all over the place because, of course, they don't publish them publicly, but it's in the billions of dollars that BLM has raised, and the
Mm-hmm.
at least $10 billion that them plus their related organizations have raised. And I have no idea what profitable things that they're doing with those. So I guess the question to contemplate is where and how this BLM movement fits into Black history.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something positive, and can we make it something positive, especially with all that funding that I have no, it's just amazing the amounts of money that they've gotten, the billions, and I have no idea what's going on with it. So I'm wondering your perspective on that, since we talked about that a little bit last time, and it's another divisive issue that we need to figure out how to be less divisive over.
Right. Well, the answer to your multiple questions is no, 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 and no.
Okay.
And they're easy answers.
Right.
And I think I said this then, but I think it's even more relevant now. People, BLM has been raising these billions, not just in the past year or so, but they've been raising, this money now for basically more than a decade. And people are unaware of the volume or the level of their involvement in the public school system as it relates to teaching, their beliefs and, critical race theory and all that stuff.
Right.
And they are basically an institution within an institution as it relates to public education in the United States. And very few people are externally aware of that. And they are actually quite loath to reveal this anytime anybody ever questions it. I mean, for example, as difficult as it is to fire a teacher, generally speaking, if a teacher criticizes the Black Lives Matter school curriculum, which there is a curriculum, if they criticize it in any way, they have been immediately dismissed.
Wow.
Immediately fired. As difficult as historically it's been.
More divisiveness.
Right. Exactly. So, but then that person disappears and nobody's watching. So, I anyone who supports BLM, I mean, they're supporting the intention, or at least the stated intention of BLM. They're ignoring the Marxist roots of BLM and the implications that they are ultimately anti-democratic, anti-family,
anti-capitalism,
and anti-male. And those have significant. Now, you might be of a political bent that agrees with those things, and there you go. So go off and be a BLM supporter.
Yeah.
But the other side is, if Black Lives Matter, here's something that to me is actually quite obvious. The only Black lives that this entire movement cares about are Black people who are already dead. There's not a single case.
Because the point you were making last time is that their main product is revisionist history. Yeah, and which is a tough one to me, and that's why I think it kind of gets into our sort of thread of the subject today, which is it's so hard to discern reality anymore. And now, especially when you've got billions of dollars focused on revising history, so if we thought we knew what had happened in history, we're going to have that revised. It just gets harder and harder to figure out our place in the world, in the social psychological environment, especially when we're constantly being told to, reevaluate what our place is in history, not just our place in history, what history was, but our responsibility for it. All this, white guilt and white fragility and all this other stuff where and I'm all for I'm of course just about everybody can get behind racism is bad, but the bad thing that goes on there is you just change it to another form of racism, which is
Correct.
prejudice. Instead of being against one group, it's to another.
Mm-hmm.
And then you haven't solved anything. You just kind of move the needle a little bit.
Right. And
So,
to be completely unaware of basically transposing, where
yeah,
that racism is applied,
right.
and to be completely not self-aware enough to really get that, to me is has been,
Mm,
fascinating to observe.
yeah,
But as it relates to what has BLM done objectively to improve the Black community,
yeah,
and the answer is absolutely nothing.
right,
They don't work in the Black community. They don't work to improve the actual lives of living Black people. BLM's mission is to change the minds of white people so that they basically denigrate themselves, demean
right.
themselves, and ultimately hand away their wealth, power, and influence in the society over to BLM, not even to
Yeah, not Black people.
minorities.
BLM with their huge multi-billion-dollar organization. That
Hmm.
the only thing that we know about it is that it's very anti-American and pro-Marxist and
Hmm.
pro-collectivist,
Hmm.
and we don't really know what their agenda is, other than it's just this rogue Marxist organization.
Well, at this point, it's actually establishment
Yeah,
organization,
yeah,
because
yeah.
basically they've taken over the educational system in the United
Right,
States, public education for sure,
right.
but also those sentiments. I was speaking with a friend of mine recently, and his daughter is attending one of the most exclusive elementary schools in the country. I mean, they pay close to $50,000 a year for
Mm,
elementary school, actually for kindergarten, in all fairness.
right.
And they are getting all of these BLM centered letters, coming home, in terms of, let's establish your level of whiteness and what's
Yeah.
going on and those things. And he and his wife are actively, pursuing other options. They're even
Yeah.
looking at Catholic schools. They would have never looked at a religiously based school, but they're actually
Right.
actively looking at sending their daughter to a Catholic school to
Right.
escape, all this.
Yeah,
And that's
because
a very big
in
deal.
effect, it's a new religion, because you're taught what to have faith in, and
Hmm.
people push it with religious fervency, and it's all about
Hmm.
having faith in the doctrines that they teach. And so
Hmm.
it's like, yeah, it would make sense to uh, for people to consider traditionally religious schools, because now the public schools are churning into a new form of religion, which is
Correct.
this Marxism religion, and whatever else.
Correct.
And the other reason I bring this up too is because there has been some friends and professional sort of relationships that I've had that I know have been lost just because I question these movements.
Hmm.
And there's been, fights I've had with close friends when it's like, I don't like want to stop, you know, I don't want to have I'm not like pushing for racism just because I question a Marxist organization, but which is often how it's looked. And I've known other people too. It's not like just in myself. I've known other people of all genders and ethnic backgrounds where
Hmm.
they've lost close friendships just over questioning
Hmm.
these Marxist organizations. And that that's really problematic, especially in these strange times, because you want to have people to be able to
Well,
have good deep
that's what's
relationships and have
fueling
these
these.
conversations. Yeah.
Those are the beliefs that are fueling these strange
Right,
times.
because it just comes off really strange and very divisive, that if you just question the organization, then you must be the very thing that everybody is trying to be against, which is racist. It's like,
Hmm.
no, I'm of course racism is bad, but do we have to support Marxist organizations just because we don't want racism? And then just by questioning that, but it's like, so you're saying Black lives don't matter then? It's just like the Patriot Act.
I'm
So you're
saying that you say.
unpatriotic. Yeah, so you're unpatriotic because you don't want the Patriot Act. No, it's just that's just the name of the bill. It's really
Right.
the act that violates everyone's privacy. That's the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean,
So
and it's interesting. It's like I'm saying that you're saying that
yeah,
Black Lives don't matter.
Yeah.
But beyond that, you are correct in that, but it's also a mechanism
Right. Right.
to squelch dissent. It's a
Right.
mechanism to squelch, in effect, debate.
Hmm.
So anytime anybody says, how dare you question?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Questioning is a fundamental dynamic of existence.
Right. Right.
And one of the reasons that individuals, or people who value individualism, are skeptical of the benefits of collectivism, is because at the end of the day, under a collectivist universe, you're not allowed to question, the collectivist ideals.
Right.
You're not allowed in any way to deviate from them. Your compliance is absolutely necessary. And
Right.
and the people that really support collectivism, even instinctually, have no problem with complying. So they're not
Right.
threatened. They're not threatened with compliance. They're actually energized,
Right.
by their own compliance and the social proof of other people's compliance. And they
Yeah.
don't really question it, and they're under no threat. And they feel that
Mm,
they're under threat of by an individualistic system. That then
right.
competence and then productivity, become the standards, as opposed to quote unquote mere existence.
Yeah. And the really tricky dynamic. So somebody posted this question the other day, and I think it was a different Facebook group, but he said, "Is morality subjective?" And what I said is it's a trans-subjective process, actually. And so what that
I'm sorry,
means,
say that it's a trans what?
it's a
Trans
trans-subjective process. And so by trans-subjective
transsubject.
meaning that it's experienced subjectively, but it's above our subjectivity, which we can't really exactly make it objective because it's experienced subjectively. And I
Hmm.
say it's trans-subjective, and it's a process like that because, to the point a minute ago, is that we need to constantly be questioning it and how that it's implemented. So just like we might say the Constitution or privacy or murder is wrong or killing is wrong or any number of other specific acts or specific values, those will stay largely the same. But as the culture changes, we have to constantly question it so it can be updated for the updated culture. Just like we said with
Hmm.
the Dark Ages, it seemed like we were on a flat Earth, but over time we realized we're not, so we needed to update that. Same thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's always going to be things that will need to be updated, but we have to uh, constantly be questioning it so that we can make those updates. But most people don't want to do that because they want to be part of the collectivist mind, which is to,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, and even you know, and they're quick to point out
yeah,
or people that are against, the capitalist and even colonialism for that matter.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm not saying that I'm in favor of it.
yeah,
What I'm getting at is that every system is flawed. Every system has its own problems.
right,
But I think where the founding fathers were actually quite genius was they chose a set of principles,
mm,
right, that in effect produced the least amount of harm.
right,
Because if you were to say, okay, I want a capitalistic model, and
mm,
another person wants a socialistic collectivist model,
right,
and then you wait 10 years, there's an inevitability that the capitalistic model has produced more freedom, more productivity, more comfort, to citizens than the socialistic
prosperity,
model, prosperity
yeah,
than the socialistic model has.
mm,
And they made the choice of which morality they
right,
preferred, because some
right,
people would still choose the socialistic morality, and they would still choose discomfort and pain and lack of productivity and
yeah,
driving the Trabant, in 1985 when there's Ferraris across the street in the same year. Some people are comforted by that. But
yeah,
if we look at the larger pool of things, which and in the bigger picture, which of those mindsets, which of those sets of principles is actually sustainable? And for better or for worse, capitalism has ultimately proven again and again and again to be the sustainable model.
yeah.
And anytime, mhm,
It's almost the difference. I think it was Nietzsche who talked about the slave morality, which is
mhm,
basically that and some people have trouble with that because the word slave is so controversial. But
of
basically, it's
course,
like some people, they want to be slaves to a moral system, whereas other
Mhm.
people want to be free to the moral system of freedom, which gives you the freedom to screw up and learn from your screw
Mhm.
ups.
Mhm.
And uh, that's some, and it gets into what we talked about a while ago, that how some people are going to really gravitate towards one and some the other, but
Mhm.
those who are going to gravitate toward the collectivist model are going to be really afraid of losing it, because they need everyone to buy into it for it to work, so they're going to constantly be
Mhm.
afraid of anyone who wants individuality or freedom.
That's right.
So
That's right.
they're giving themselves over to a slave system, a slavery system that they want to be uh, indentured to, and they want to choose who their masters are going to be for themselves and their neighbors.
Mhm.
And it's a
And their neighbors, exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
And
it's a tough system. It's a tough world
and
that
I'll
we're
add that the
have to
people
be
that are
there.
advocating for the collectivist solution,
Yeah.
are also people who are not observant of the outcomes
Right.
in advance. They're not. I find that they're not terribly able to think in the abstract.
Right.
And
Right.
as such, when the reality of the policies that they pursued are set
Mm-hmm.
in, what they will do is they will then create band-aids to basically hide those outcomes.
Right.
So, for example, if we look at the explosion of homelessness here in Los Angeles, we can also, if we're honest about it,
Mm-hmm.
we can see that it's been collectivist policies that have produced this explosion of homelessness.
Right.
But instead of addressing it as such, what they'll do is they'll simply apply band-aids to the problem.
Right.
They might build houses and they might certainly go on a PR campaign to hide the
Yeah.
number of homeless,
Right.
but they will not actually address the root cause of that homelessness.
Right.
And they're perfectly fine with applying again band-aids and smoke screens to make it seem like the problem basically doesn't exist. I mean, as companies were leaving, this also in cases in New York, but definitely the case here, both governors were saying, well, those people are stupid for leaving. Those
Yeah.
people aren't smart enough to find solutions to be able to stay. But in reality, for those of us who do care about outcomes, you know,
Right.
companies are escaping literally hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes to their
Right.
revenue. That when they go to Texas or Florida, for that matter,
Right.
they instantly save by simply crossing a geographic boundary.
Right.
It doesn't take a lot of genius to identify how to save literally hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, when Toyota left California, it saved
Mm-hmm.
potentially billions of dollars in taxes
Right.
just by crossing state lines.
And not just their own taxes, but also what a lot of people don't realize in that analysis is a lot of it is the payroll tax.
Mhm.
In the
Huge,
payroll tax
a
that
substantial amount is the payroll tax. Holy cow.
yeah, and which means it's not just like they're moving their headquarters there because they want to save some of those taxes that the headquarters pays for being located in a certain state. They want to move their jobs over because of the payroll tax on both sides, the individual and the
Mhm.
business.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And then the proponents of, these higher taxes are saying, oh, they're just afraid. They don't want to face their responsibility of paying these taxes.
Yeah.
And that's their argument, but
Yeah.
they're losing that argument,
Right.
from those who have remained rational.
Right.
Governor Newsom has now, the signatures have now well past the threshold of
Mm-hmm.
triggering a recall vote, on his being governor, and the same engines are in place now in New York for Governor Cuomo.
Right.
To basically be investigated at a minimum and removed, ultimately. So here we are. I think that there is a renaissance. I think that now is the time for a renaissance in thought. I mean, as
Yeah.
January 20th approached and passed,
Right.
again, I had seen, prior to that, I had seen literally no rational thought in journalism anywhere.
Right.
And now, as soon as the 20th has come and gone, I see actual signs of rational thought, returning to journalism. And I read articles that now make sense. I read articles that are now rooted in cause and effect. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Glenn Greenwald was basically fighting alone,
Right.
for the previous 4 years, and now his
Mm-hmm.
voice is even louder
Right.
because the
Right.
the critiques that he has of the current administration, by far, I mean, as critical as he was of the previous administration,
Mm-hmm.
he is by far more critical. 30 days in. than he was of the previous administration. I think that's very important because he's in no way a fan of the previous administration, but his criticisms now are actually much more intense. And and,
Yeah.
and who's noticing that?
What, which I think leads to a good point, which is, and we talked about this a little bit in closing last time, but the idea of how do we get a better grip on reality, especially when people don't trust their politicians and they don't trust the media.
Hmm.
So how do we do that? And this is the time, especially for the next year or two and beyond. We'll see how the next election cycle goes, to
Hmm.
really put the pressure on Washington, because this is that rare case that only happens, every 10 to 20 or 30 years, where one party has the House, the Senate, and the White House. So,
Hmm.
which is why I brought up a couple of times, is like they can do just about anything, but they're focused on this one thing, which is kind of in the past, and we're in about in 4 years, where it's like you can do just about anything you want, pass about anything that will help the world, but instead you're just still enwrapped in this whole like Trump thing. I think I said on the
Right.
Facebook group that the left and the media, especially the media, they just remind me of like a bad relationship, like a bad breakup where one person moves on and the other person still keeps stalking the other person. It's
Hmm.
like, move on, let's, like, you have the power to get things done now, so do it. So I guess the kind of like concluding question is, how do we get a better grip on reality, especially in this strange world that we're in, where one side seems to have all the power but just want to focus on the past election and the election in 4 years. So
Yeah, I think it's the right question. I think it's a very good question. I think,
yeah,
from where I sit,
yeah, yeah,
recognize that government is a product, it is not a source.
right,
And people have positioned in their minds that government is some kind of a source of our salvation, the source of our
yeah,
economy, the source of our happiness, the source of our ability to prosper. And
right,
and government is literally a product of people's minds and ideas
right,
in that. And I think that if there's any proof of that,
mhm,
is their focus on this second impeachment.
yeah,
Because guess what? The constituents of the people that are forcing or proposing or basically enacted this impeachment completely supported it.
right,
So if we're talking about a representative government, the people that actually vote for the politicians that led this impeachment actually wanted this impeachment. So they were being accurately and appropriately represented
yeah,
in the minds of their constituents. And I think that's a
right,
very important thing to realize, is that they weren't acting, as rogue, these
right,
politicians. They were
right,
acting under the marching orders of the people that voted them into this office. So I think that's one dynamic. I
right,
think, you've I think done a great job of identifying what people don't trust in society. And I think that we need
right,
to take a half a step back and look at what
yeah,
we do trust in this society. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
do we still trust the words of Dr. King? Do we still
right,
trust the words of Mahatma Gandhi?
right,
Do we still trust those people? Is what they say still valid in some way or in all
right,
ways?
mhm,
Because we need to, it's sort of like when you're going to work out. It's like, I
right,
want to run a marathon, right? And then you realize, you get out there 10 minutes into the run, you realize I can't run a marathon.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the reality is, what can you do? And if you've run
mhm,
100 yards, okay, you've run 100 yards. You
right,
just have 26 miles plus to go.
yeah, yeah,
But the reality is, you still run 100 yards. So what can you trust? Can you
mhm,
trust that, when you turn on the lights are going to come on? Do
right,
you trust that your car is going to run? I mean, those might be, slightly abstracted ideas, but can you trust your partner?
right.
Can and if not, why? But what are the things that you can trust?
Can you
Can you
trust your
trust
own
that?
gut?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
well, I don't want to go there yet, because
okay, yeah,
people have different valuations
right,
of
right, right,
how and when they trust their gut. So
yeah,
that's kind of an abstraction, but
yeah,
I'm trying to stick to the first.
it's a tricky one, but I think what you're right. What people are getting at is they're trying to figure out what they can trust, and
Hmm.
a lot of it is they're testing against their own gut, but
Hmm.
they're also, which can sometimes be misleading. So yeah, that's a tricky one. But yeah, if we look at Dr. King, Gandhi, even Socrates, and something that we mentioned
Correct.
the last
Exactly.
time. It's we can look at those and we can say these are the principles that we can draw from that we know will be consistent just about throughout all time. There's going to be, of course, updated ways to apply them to the new generation, but we can find things that we can trust, and it's actually a good thing that we can identify that we can't trust the media. That, and because that's where I get a lot of my I don't know if I'd say if it's a gut or just like a understanding of what to question and what to really be suspicious of are the things the media is really pushing, because I know they're not pushing that for my benefit or my survival or my prosperity. They're pushing it for theirs. So if they're really pushing something, then I'm going to question why. And it's like, oh, it's just to sell their own product. Okay, so that's not what I'm necessarily interested in.
Right, exactly. And then to be able to stand up to that and say, look, what you've offered me,
Right.
isn't true. What you've offered me isn't valuable. But
Right.
I think people are also kind of afraid to make those assessments on their own because they've handed
Right.
out the ability to make those assessments to quote unquote authorities and quote unquote
Right. Right.
experts who have been proven not only wrong, but have been proven that they've given us deliberately given us inaccurate information time and time and time and time again.
Right.
So, what can you trust? Do you trust Gandhi? Do you trust Machiavelli for that matter? Do
Yeah.
you trust Aristotle? You know, do you trust Carl Sagan? Do you trust what scientists do we still trust Einstein? I mean,
Yeah.
what about it do we trust? And if you look also at elements that we either trusted or used to trust, look at the deliberate attempts to remove those people from our consciousness. There's now the movement
Right.
to remove Shakespeare from the schools. Now, from my perspective, to me, it was inevitable and only a matter of time. But I'm
Yeah.
in a sense, surprised that it took this long. But when
Mm.
you look at the principles of Dr. King that are now being vilified,
Yeah.
that the content of character is now a bad thing. It is, I think, informative before it's scary
Right.
of what individuals need to do. And for
Right.
those of us, and I guess it'll be a battle between those of us who actually view ourselves as individuals versus people who view
Right.
themselves as a small group that cannot survive without being attached to a larger entity. I mean, remember, there's a great scene in the original, the Richard Donner Superman, that when Lois was hanging out of the helicopter and ultimately the helicopter fell off the top of the building and Superman swoops in, as Superman does, and grabs her and grabs the helicopter.
Yeah.
And he says, "Don't worry, Lois, I've got you." And she looks at him and says, "You've got me. Who's got you?" And if you look at the bigger question that line produces, some people cannot fathom that some other people can do things entirely on their own.
Right. Right.
That there is that autonomy exists. She literally couldn't fathom that Superman was basically Superman.
Right.
That
Right.
he was able to manage the challenge of rescuing her, rescuing the helicopter without somebody else's support. She couldn't fathom that Superman was in fact an individual, a
Right.
sovereign
Right. Right.
entity. She could not process that. In spite of the fact that he was busy rescuing her at the time. So
Right.
this is the battle that I see. My brother and I like rolled over backwards every time. It's such a profound film in exactly that regard,
Right.
because it's a profound examination of collectivism versus individualism in such a big way that we get lost in the capes and the tights and the boots. But we really have to get that at its core, most superhero stories are really battles of individual identity
Yeah.
and autonomy, versus a collectivist solution, and
Yeah.
that's why comics are
Well,
so
that's
important.
ultimately what the hero's story or the hero's journey is about, is someone ascending to, whether they have superpowers or not, they ascend to over some collective evil, and they have to do so by drawing out within themselves a great greater, not like greater good of the way that we but of a higher principle that's within every individual. So that, which is the interesting thing about it, is it's like this dichotomy of within every individual there's this collective, you can overcome and almost be like Superman, or at least a hero, if you pull out those deeply rooted values that are within every individual, compared to rather pulling from the collective. Uh,
Mhm.
so that's like what the hero's journey is, and that's why, because that story is at least thousands of years old, maybe tens of thousands of years old, um, it works. Whereas when Hollywood tries to reconfigure it into something else, those are the stories that fail, and like people just don't get into it, because
Well, I mean, now
that's the
you're
ultimate
talking.
journey. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now you're talking about archetypical,
Yeah.
identity and archetypical realities
Mm,
that are, for better or for worse,
mm,
we're biologically predisposed to comply with. But I
right.
will challenge a little bit the presumption that it's rooted in all of us. I'm really moving to the mode of thinking
Mm,
that those values may not be the most fundamental values in all people. Because if they were, I think that certain philosophies wouldn't really exist. I don't think that people would cling to, collectivism as firmly as they do if at the root of who they are
mm,
is individualism. And I think that if, I mean, granted, I agree with you that those dynamics exist in each of us, but I think the proportion of those of those forces that exist
mm,
is the nuance that I think needs to be discussed. Because if at its root,
mm.
people really did, if everyone did indeed value individualism, then we wouldn't see such a schism, we wouldn't see such a split in society where people become so entrenched in one side or the other. They would see that those sides need to work together.
Well, what this gets into is how that, mm, and it's this. Of course, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this. It's the whole idea of how, there's the book Ordinary Men that I haven't read, but it's recommended. How that basically anyone could become an Auschwitz guard, or anyone could
Mhm,
become a person who pushes, the gulags or whatever else. Um, and that is to be sucked up into the hive mind or the herd mind. And um, Marie
I would
Louise
argue
von
that.
Franz talked a lot about this. How that she would see, because she's originally from Germany, that she would
Mhm,
see people who would just start out in sort of what she called our individual shadow, which is they just want to have financial security, and so
mhm,
in that interest, they would get assimilated into the Nazi regime, or that type of movement. So um, when I say people are trying to draw out those sort of universal values from within themselves,
mhm,
it's not necessarily individualism. What's happening is our universal values are pulled out through an individual experience,
mhm,
but on our sort of like ego consciousness mind, it is easier to say, well, let's just do what everybody else is doing because that must be the safest uh, thing to do. You don't have to think
mhm,
about it.
mhm,
So the challenge is always going to be do what everybody else is doing, because on the surface that's going to look safe, versus question it against your own internal observation and realize what everybody else is doing sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong, and we need to stand up for when what everybody else is doing is the wrong thing.
mhm,
So that's why there's that dichotomy against our sort of like inherited values versus our collectivist values. And there
mhm,
there will always be that challenge going on. And in the thing, yeah, it's just like experience through the individual.
mhm,
So you've got to sometimes question the herd or the collectivist and say, and question that against your the values of history. And that's why we have to look at people like Gandhi, Dr. King, uh, Socrates, and others, and say, what would they do? How would they confront the situation? Or,
mhm.
what are those deep values that we could see throughout time are going to renew the culture rather than destroy it by sucking it into this collectivist mindset.
Right.
So that
And
dichotomy is
and
constantly going on. But go ahead.
and the great part is we have the benefit of, knowing what they would do because they
Right.
left their extensive writings, that articulate, exactly what they would do. And and
Right.
and those writings are currently under tremendous threat
Right.
because
Right.
there are answers there, and certain people don't want those answers found. But to your point, I
Right.
think that the therein lays this other not dichotomy, but facet or
Mm.
ingredient of our existence, and that's this
Right.
idea of nuance. Because you can say the lights on, you can say the lights off,
Hmm.
but there's a bigger question of where does the power come from that gets the light to come on,
Hmm.
independent of the light switch.
Right.
People literally do focus on the light switch. It's better, lights better on, lights better
Yeah.
off. But
Right.
but at the end of the day, there's a bigger question as to where the energy comes from for it to work at all.
Hmm.
And that so I think you're right. I think that there is those fundamental dynamics of human nature, and I think
Right.
the fundamental dynamics of how we work together
Hmm.
is ultimately embracing of the nuance. And actually,
Right.
that's where the conversation can take place. That's where the give and take can take place. And
Hmm.
that's where the operating principles can be identified. I think that we have been tricked and pulled and dragged to
Mm.
be very politely forced, I'll say, to
Hmm.
believe that nuance doesn't matter. And I
Hmm.
think that as soon as we eliminated the necessity of nuance, we eliminated the necessity of thinking. And
Right.
when we eliminate the necessity of thinking, all that's left is either rebellion or compliance. And that's where
Right.
we are. And as soon
Mm.
as we have this dynamic of rebellion and compliance, you now have polarization.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
now, whoever the powers that be can now control the entire
Mm.
society
Right.
through that polarization. And that's the
Right.
part that I think that the powers that be are enormously guilty of,
Right.
and we have been sucked into it at our peril,
Mm.
but we have been in large part taken advantage of. But I think the
Right.
difference is, do we continue? The choice now is, do we continue to be taken advantage of in this way, or
Hmm.
do we wake up and realize that we've been taken advantage of and then begin to rebuild our own autonomy and
Right.
our
Right.
own awareness and an identification of what we do trust? Because I
Mm.
think it's a huge mistake to see all of these conflicts through the eyes of political partisanship or even
Right.
through politics at all. I think as soon as we're talking about politics, we're no longer actually being honest with what the actual issues really are.
Right. Uh, Tricky stuff, man. Scary stuff.
Very tricky stuff.
Yeah.
Very tricky stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we did this. We'll do it again sometime. And I'll leave the links to your stuff again, and send me that article too, so I can leave it in the links that you wrote recently on this. Do you have anything else to add before we wrap it up, McCall?
I think that's it. I just want to
Yeah.
reiterate, the only
Mm.
way out of this is we get back to things that we trust.
Right. Right.
And sometimes those things that we trust aren't necessarily true, but we trust them.
Mm.
And I think that we need to individually go back to a state where we are comfortable.
Mm.
Because if we're not comfortable, we're never going to be comfortable enough to trust the person sitting next to us. And if we're
Right.
not trusting them, we are certainly not listening to them.
Right. Right.
So even if we're making the mistake of where we sit or where we stand, I think it's
Mm.
important that we're comfortable to engage these conversations.
Right. Right.
Because as long as we're on the defensive, as long as we are calling the other person a liar, as long as
Yeah.
we're calling the person all kinds of names, it doesn't matter where we sit.
Mhm.
We have chopped off the ability to actually have a dialogue that can produce, any kind of an outcome.
Right. Right.
So that's what I suggest. I find a way to be comfortable, find a way to be happy, find a way to, enjoy, even if it's enjoying a sunset, to
Right.
do anything you can to calm yourself down, eat
Right.
better for that matter.
Yeah.
Calm yourself down that you can begin to re-engage with yourself because you're harming yourself at the end of the day. If you're
Mm.
tense all the time, your blood pressure is going up. If you're tense all the time, you're pushing yourself
Mm.
closer to a heart attack. You're not eating right. You're not sleeping right. And therefore your entire health is being compromised
Mm.
by this conflict. So find yourself, chill, meditate.
Yeah. That's tricky stuff, and I don't know if there's much I can add to that. Although at the same time, I want to add a lot to it because it's so much. But there's so much in being able to unify within. That the more
Mhm.
we're unified within, the more that affects our culture to become unified. Not
Right.
necessarily that we need to just comply to each other, but we need to have understanding for each other. And the thing that happens too is when we have an internal disassociation, we project that out externally, and then the whole culture becomes disassociated.
Correct. I agree.
And so the more that we can become unified within, the more everyone will become united in the culture. So it's really hard to go out and be like, you need to unify, you need to unify like this. Where really what we need to do is, like you were just saying, find ways to become internally united, and then what'll happen too is you'll become just more, like you were saying earlier, creative, and at a better peace of mind and place of mind, because it'll unlock that unconscious mind, that creative brain, just by convincing yourself you're going to be okay, you're not at threat, you're not a prey animal right now, just relax. And then it unlocks so much more of your brain and your thinking, and you can just enjoy life instead of constantly thinking the apocalypse.
Yeah. True.
All right, so yeah, we went a little long, but it was all good stuff. And yeah, I'll link everything down below. And so thanks a lot again for joining us. And yeah,
Thanks
stay
for
in
having
touch,
me on
McCall.
again. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, all right,
Thanks.
cool. I'll leave